Welcome back to the Go Global Ed podcast, brought to you by the International and Foreign Language Education Team, also known as IFLE, in the Office of Post-Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. My name is Amy Marion, and today I'll be your host. On the Go Global Ed podcast, we speak with IFLE grant and fellowship recipients to highlight their experiences, discuss issues in international and foreign language education, and explore the long-term value and impact of IFLE programs. Today I speak with Talia Lieber, a current PhD candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, and a 2021 recipient of the Fulbright-Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad, or DDRA Fellowship. The DDRA Fellowship program provides grants to colleges and universities to fund individual doctoral students who conduct research in other countries in modern foreign languages and area studies for periods of 6 to 12 months. Talia's dissertation focuses on 20th century collections of art in Rwanda. For her DDRA fellowship, Talia traveled to Rwanda for 7 months and conducted research for her project entitled Cattle Visions, the Creation and Collection of Art in the Kingdom of Rwanda. I'm excited to speak with Talia today to learn more about her project, research experience in Rwanda, and to see if she has any tips for future folks applying to the DDRA. Talia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Amy.
Excited for our chat today. So we're going to start out pretty easy. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what sparked your interest in historical and contemporary art and your PhD research in Rwanda?
Yeah, so I am an art historian. I study African art with a specialization in historic art. And I have been working in Rwanda since my undergraduate period. I was first in Rwanda as a volunteer as part of a service learning trip to a youth village for orphans of the 1994 genocide. And then I decided to return to the country to get to know a bit more about the history and get to know people better. And so there I was able to do an independent study project where I was introduced to many different contemporary artists working in studios and galleries throughout Rwanda. And so I really had a good sense of how the contemporary art scene was developing and what kinds of things artists were interested in terms of looking back in their history. But I really didn't know so much about the art history of Rwanda at that point. So then I had been working in a museum when I got back from Rwanda. I also had applied for the Fulbright U.S. Student Research Fellowship. And so I had the opportunity to go back again to Rwanda and really get to know contemporary artists and kind of delve into that research more into what the practice is, what kinds of studio practices the artists are doing. And then once I came back, worked again in a museum, so a mix between Rwanda museum work, I again became more interested in the historical art and especially in objects. So I applied to PhD programs, went to UCLA, and once I was there, I realized that I didn't really want to switch my topic too much. I wanted to stay focused on Rwanda. And so my interests really developed more into what objects are still in Rwanda today. So that's a bit about just how I entered into Rwanda and into this topic specifically.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So like several different times in Rwanda and working at museums in the U.S. and then kind of going back over there to see the art there. Were the museums here in the U.S., did they have any objects or things from Rwanda or Africa in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So where I worked at the Baltimore Museum of Art, there were only a few objects from Rwanda. But where I was at UCLA at the Fowler Museum, the curator and fellow took me through all the storage shelves, and we went through and saw every object that was accessible from Rwanda, which was a lot. After I advanced to candidacy, I was able to do a predoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian, where they also have many objects from Rwanda, especially in the Natural History Museum. And then there's also a bunch in Europe because of German and Belgian colonization in Rwanda. A lot of the objects were taken out.
Wow, very interesting. So in 2021, you were awarded the DDRA Fellowship and you spent around 7 months conducting research in Rwanda. And the language that you used is Kinyarwanda throughout your research. So could you tell us a little bit more about a couple of your key findings while you were there?
Yeah, basically when I got to Rwanda, because I knew I only had 7 months there, I really hit the ground running. I started, before I even got there, I contacted people that I knew, let them know I was coming. And then I was able to kind of set up field visits at different museums, conversations with cultural heritage specialists, museum professionals, and people that were just also interested in objects from Rwanda. So one big finding from my research was that I was able to conduct research at a missionary collection, which what I had read about in an archive. There were some archival materials from that missionary museum, but I really didn't know that it was a museum that was up and running and had been in existence since its founding in the 1940s. So when I was there, I was able to make connections finally in the Catholic Church, Kabgayi, Rwanda, and was able to meet with a priest who took me around the museum and explained to me how the diocese is kind of revamping the museum and trying to open it to the public. So I'm hoping that my research will bring attention to the collection, and they're hoping that it will entice tourists also to come and visit the museum. So that's a kind of way that Rwanda is seeing cultural heritage today. It's also as a way to bring people to these spaces and interact with artists and makers, but also to learn about the heritage. So even if they're in Rwanda to see the gorillas, there's a cultural heritage site that they can go visit. And so this museum has a rich collection. They even have a few sacred drums in the collection. And the key is that archival material, the documents that kind of explain a little bit more about how these objects came into the hands of the church, and who the priests worked with to collect and acquire these objects.
Wow, that's great. I'm looking forward to hearing how that goes, and bringing more awareness to these places and the missionaries.
Yeah, missionary museum, exactly. There's also ethnographic museum in Rwanda that's well known, and in Huye, Rwanda, and it's been in existence since 1989. But the collection goes back farther than that. And so another finding from my research was when I was able to go to the ethnographic museum, which I had been to before, but through this project, I was able to go into storage with curators and museum management specialists, and also to bring a former director and cultural heritage specialist back into the museum to talk with current staff and myself about the objects and how he went about acquiring things. And so another finding was when we were in storage, and I have a recording of this too, which is very neat. I have a recording of the curator saying, wow, like it's there. And it was a drum that the former director had remembered acquiring in 1990 for the museum collection, but that the staff really hadn't seen since then. And it hadn't been on view, and the community hadn't been able to access it since 1990 because of a civil war that endured right after its collection and also after the genocide. So this is an example of the kinds of things that, even though these objects have been there for years and years, there's still new discoveries and new research that can be developed.
That's amazing. So you mentioned the drum, a couple different drums maybe. What are a couple examples of other objects that you uncovered or saw while you were there?
Yeah, so Rwanda is known for their basket work and also their Imigongo cow dung paintings. Those are two very well-known objects in Rwanda, or genres. But really what I was looking at more were royal objects and sacred objects that have been acquired and used by the Mwami, or the king of Rwanda, the royal family, and also protected by guardians called abiru, who were special advisors to the Mwami at court. And so there aren't so many objects still in Rwanda from this royal collection, but it was something that I was interested in doing more research about. So part of my time there was also inquiring different cultural heritage specialists about these types of objects. And the reason my project is called Cattle Visions is because cattle played such an important role in the well-being of the kingdom and in giving the king his power. And so there are objects, the Imigongo is one example of cow dung painting where cattle is present, but there were also objects in a royal collection that were in the shape of cattle horns. And so Rwanda is known for having these amazing cows that have called inyambo, with long horns. And so these objects were in the form, these pronged objects with extended lateral extensions that really reference the cattle. And you see this also in Rwandan dance and choreography, where people move their hands in outward motion to imitate cattle horns, but you also see it in visual imagery. And so you have it in these iron hammer anvils that were part of the royal collection, and you also have it in adornments that women wore on their temples, on their head. Those were an example that the museum has some examples of these adornments, and then some examples of sacred ritual drums that were part of the collection, but some of the objects are no longer in the museums in Rwanda.
I see. Okay. Great. So I know you had to connect with a lot of different individuals to gain access to some of these collections and the cultural heritage sites, the missionaries. So how did your knowledge of the local language in Rwanda help facilitate these connections, or was it more important for understanding what you were looking at, or how did language play into your time in Rwanda?
Yeah, Kinyarwanda is hugely important for research. And I'm sorry to say that my proficiency in Kinyarwanda isn't as strong as it could be and should be. The reason I say it's not strong enough is that because there's so many subtleties in Kinyarwanda language. For example, there's so many different words just for milk, spilled milk, used milk that's within the like every different iteration just within one word. And so I was able to use my Kinyarwanda to kind of make these connections, the basic greetings, finding my way, navigating. And also, and this was very important, when meeting with people, if they were talking in Kinyarwanda, I was able to kind of understand what was going on. And that's important because body language mixed with knowing keywords and phrases really makes a difference in terms of how you're able to connect with someone. And then I would also say French is really important. So my reading knowledge of French really helped me in the archive, and also secondary information about the collections that I'm looking at. So yeah, Kinyarwanda with help from translator, and then also French really did help.
So how did the people in Rwanda react to the research that you were doing there?
Yeah, so people were very interested and really grateful that I was doing this research, which was so funny to hear because I was so grateful to them for being a part of it. So for me, I've known that I was interested in this for so long, but this is something that so many people have been working on for decades, but it hasn't really been a topic of art historical conversations. I've often heard, what's the art in Rwanda, or is there something really to study there? And so this research, I'm really hoping will bring out the fact that there are objects still in Rwanda that, there's still narratives to be told about these works, and that maybe some of the collections outside of Rwanda that hold objects from Rwanda, people might start being able to access those and to get more information about what exactly is existing in the diaspora. And so there's a lot of interest now in Rwanda about repatriation and restitution, trying to see, what's in the country, but also what isn't there and how can we get it back. But there hasn't been so much forward movement in terms of formal requests from these other institutions. And so a lot of the response was, how is my research going to help with that kind of forward movement in terms of requesting objects and what objects to request in the first place. And I think what was really cool for me was that it was intergenerational excitement about, the objects. It was older people that I spoke with. They've grown up with objects like this in their homes, with their grandparents wearing adornments on their bodies that are no longer worn today, but that some of people still have in their possession or used to have. And then there's younger people that have kind of seen some of these pictures online or in books, but never really knew so much about the objects. And they really are curious to learn more. And I know that's kind of generalizing in terms of young and old, but it's not just necessarily cultural heritage workers or artists that are interested in these things. It's people in, all industries across fields that are interested and can find their own avenue of connection, graphic design, computer, data, like everyone's interested in, what exists in terms of cultural heritage.
Okay, so I know you've been to Rwanda several times and you were there for 7 months doing your DDRA. And I understand that Rwanda is part of what we call the Great Lakes region in Africa. So I was just curious if there was, any unique aspects to your time there from living in that region that you might want to share with folks that are listening.
Yeah, living in Rwanda is one of the most wonderful experiences. It's why I keep going back. Rwanda is a relatively easy place to kind of jump into and live and make friends. And I think a big part of that is just being really open to new experiences and to seeing different things. And so this time living in Rwanda, I think I was much more familiar with the landscape and had been to certain places before. So I kind of had a sense of what I wanted to see. And I was pretty laser focused on my research. So I didn't do as much of the touristy visiting, but just being in Rwanda, I did long drives often to get to my research sites, to different collections, and it never gets old. I mean, the views that you have there, it's the most beautiful place in the world. You have rolling hills, red dirt, clean roads, and really amazing people who are willing to help you and really do want the best for you if you are willing to also make that effort with them.
Okay, great. So I think you kind of touched a little while ago about working with the different people that are connected to these collections all across the country. And so I was wondering about how you foster those connections. I know we kind of talked about language already, and you've been to Rwanda several times. But do you have any other avenues for how you created these connections and maintain them? Because part of the DDRA application is submitting support from overseas entities. So just curious if you had any insights to share about building those connections and maintaining them to work towards completing your project.
Yeah, so I think a big part of the collaboration with other organizations, other colleagues, is really sharing my research and being open to feedback. So I was always trying to have conversations, opportunities to give a lecture, opportunities to teach about my research, and then also take time to receive feedback in terms of, oh, this, you would do what really well looking at this collection, or you should really go talk to this person. So I think just having that openness in the research to show them that to show people that it's still in process was really important, rather than having a complete agenda. I think sometimes organizations, they already have so much of their own mission that when you have this somewhat independent researcher coming in, they want to make sure that it aligns with their mission, but is also open to whatever will come their way as part of the process while you're there. So, a big part of developing the connection is just reaching out and then following up to make sure that they're on board, that they understand the project. It's gotten so much easier these days because you can meet people on Zoom. WhatsApp has been a game changer in terms of always being able to text or video call with, relatively easy way to do that. Another really important part of this process is making sure that they know what you want to get out of it, trying to let them know what exactly you're interested in doing. So having clear research plan and letting them know these are the kinds of objects you want to be looking at, letting them know where you're at in the process so that they can meet you where you are.
Yeah, those are all really good suggestions.
Right. And I think another thing that I didn't mention is identifying what my own skill sets were, and then being able to share that with the organization. So if I'm a really strong writer, a really strong editor, strong public speaker, I was able to offer that to these organizations and say, if you need help with any of, these tasks, I'm available as part of my affiliation with you. So that can be if they have a research project that they're looking at, giving them feedback too, based on my knowledge, or, applying for a grant, giving them feedback on that. That's also something I think is really important. And so that you're not just constantly benefiting from their affiliation, but also offering something in return.
Yeah, I love that. I love like being really collaborative, and it's kind of more of a mutually beneficial relationship. So that's great. So that kind of leads me into my next question, actually, which is maybe a little more broad, but we were really grateful to have you attend our DDRA information session recently. And during that session, you shared some tips for future applicants to the Fulbright-Hays DDRA program. So we've kind of touched on a few things already, but is there anything else, any other tips you would have for folks that are interested in applying to the fellowship?
Yeah, so the application process is long and difficult, and it's kind of, you have to be ready when the application opens with your materials. And so for me, it was really essential to kind of gather everything and get the feedback so that when it was time to apply, I was ready to go. So that really involved reaching out to my affiliate organizations. I worked with a local university who I hadn't really worked with before, an architecture firm that was doing some work with traditional making practices, and also what turned out to be the most important affiliate for me was the Rwanda Cultural Heritage Academy, which is in charge of all the national museums in the country. So for me, it was really important to reach out to those potential affiliates, and then once they agreed, to kind of navigate what those letters would look like and make sure that I had them all in on time. The other thing would be to then start drafting your application and get as many eyes on it as possible. So for me, I was able to work very closely with my fellowship coordinator at my university, and also writing tutors through the Writing Center. And then also just other people that had either applied to the Fulbright-Hays DDRA fellowship before. And then the last tip I have is for the actual research plan to be very specific. So even if you aren't so sure that you're going to stick to it as easily, if it doesn't have to be that you can't change anything, but it does need to be that you've really thought about what you want to look at, how you're going to be looking at it, and who you need to work with in order to see those things. And it sounds easier than it is, I would say, to make a very specific research plan, because you have to really envision yourself in the country and how you're going to get around and how much time you need for different things. So as much as possible, talking to people and getting eyes on that on your application so that they can tell you that doesn't really make sense, or have you thought about this as another site, is really important.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Those are all really great tips. And for anyone who's listening, definitely take those to heart. And then also we have our DDRA application instructions, which are posted online, and they have the entire rubric for how your application will be scored. So when you are writing that detailed research plan, you can be looking at those different criteria and making sure that you're hitting all of the different boxes, and make sure you start early. I think that's a really key suggestion. So thanks for mentioning that. All right. Well, this has been very insightful, and I love hearing about your research and Rwanda, somewhere I've never been before, but hopefully one day I will make it over there. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I just want to encourage all those listening to apply. If you're thinking about it and you're not so sure, because it can be difficult to get all the materials together, you're not so sure exactly what you're going to be doing, I would say do what you can and get your application in. It's always a good idea to try, and even that process of gathering those materials will be helpful to you for your research. And so even if it's just drafting out what your project proposal would look like, or reaching out to affiliates just to see who might be interested in the project, I really do encourage you to go for it. I think in a way that's why the Go Global podcast is a really important, I think it's the exact right title, because it's just the go for it part, is actually one of the biggest hurdles for a lot of people, to think, could I be eligible for this, or could I do this realistically? And what's so nice about this project, this fellowship in particular, is the kind of support that you get. Not just financially, but also in terms of the affiliations. For me, also having the contact with the US Embassy is really important. And just having the support from your home community at UCLA, for me, was really important. So I would say, out of it's really nice when you're doing independent research like this to be a part of a larger organization. And so if you can go for it, I would.
I love that. Yeah, thanks, Talia. All right. Well, Talia, thank you so much for joining us on the Go Global Ed podcast. This has been really great.
Thank you. So much fun.
Thanks for listening to the Go Global Ed podcast, a production of the International and Foreign Language Education team in the Office of Post-Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. Be sure to follow us on X at Go Global Ed and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about upcoming podcast episodes and other IFLE updates.